So I met Dr. Carey. I met Greg through a Presbytery Bible study. We explored the Gospel of Luke for about 6 weeks and thoroughly enjoyed it. I had not been in a Bible study in a while. It had been a while. And it was great, and always left with the awareness of a new insight into how to look at Luke's gospel. And Pastor Rob was considering a very short sermon series on Revelation, and thought, wow, this would be fantastic if Greg would be available to join us for an intro to Revelation class. And so I will begin by saying that I am a student tonight, along with all of you. This book has always been one that I've kind of kept at a distance. It has always been so mysterious and unusual. I just haven't really known where to start, and I really haven't done much exploration of it. And so I am looking forward to Revelation, starting assumptions with Greg tonight, and grateful for you to give us an hour tonight of your time. And so, Greg, I turn it over to you, and grateful for your presence with us tonight.
Thank you, Joel. And I'm grateful to meet all of you. I've been checking names. It's weird. I don't have to ask you your name. I don't know what to do. Mm-hmm. So that's not true. I've been teaching on Zoom for a long time now. But anyway, it is a pleasure, and it's fun to talk about Revelation. I've done more writing and research on Revelation and apocalyptic literature than anything. And so I know when I go into churches that people largely don't have much experience with it. And so I have stuff prepared, which we can do that way. But I like to start by asking, if you came with points of curiosity, things you knew you wanted to make sure you talked about, and you can share those right now, either out loud. You don't have to raise your hands. I can see everybody. Or you could use chat, and I make notes, and then I think about the way I've prepared, and we just sort of make sure that those things get discussed. So are there items you brought that you know you like to talk about?
I just brought my curiosity.
That's wonderful, and that's a fine start. Just wanted to give you enough time to say so if there were things like that. Mm-hmm.
Greg, I'll add, I've always noted the amount of violence in Revelation.
Yeah.
And that's always perplexed me and left me with questions, just the amount of violence in it. And I think the other question would be, there are so many ways that it has been read throughout the history of Christianity, from a book that was written particular time and place to a particular group, to a book that along with a couple others in the Bible, just predicts the future. I'm sorry. So
yeah.
That's always made it, I think, why it's been kept at a distance for me.
Well, thank you. That by itself is a great start. The violence question is tough. It's tough. There are a couple of other ethical questions in Revelation that are tough. Violence isn't the only one, but it's the one a lot of people gravitate toward. The notion of God punishing the earth and seeming to like really enjoy it. You know, that's real, and we will grapple with that a little bit. The issue of, it's funny, right? When you're a biblical scholar and you work on Revelation, you are losing every day. And what I mean by that is that there are preachers on the internet and on TV and in big churches who say Revelation is predicting the world's events. When I was growing up, coming of age in the 80s, it was the Soviets. And, there was going to be a big war, nuclear war of the Soviets. And so the Soviet Union ended. And then it was, well, we've got Saddam Hussein and it's going to be over oil in the Middle East. And people were selling bestsellers about that. Then people got worked up over the year 2000, Y2K. I don't mean to be presumptuous, but it looks like everybody remembers that. And I thought that might be safe. And it's gone on and on. It was Al Qaeda, and then it was China, and who knows? I should have scanned the internet. What's interesting is some of the preachers who are selling these books and making tons of money and being on TV and being on the internet have predicted all these different things at different times and are still out there and have never apologized. Never said, whoops, but I've recalculated or whatever. So what I'll share with you as a way of getting in is that there's a lot about Revelation that even specialists don't really, really, really understand. But in terms of feeling like we basically know what's going on in the book, it's amazing how little disagreement there is among scholars with it. And what I'd like to do is start with a passage that's a little obscure. They all are. But I saw, I believe it was Joan. I saw Joan's Bible. So if you have a Bible, great. If you don't, I have slides to share. And I may hop around, right, within the slideshow, just to make sure that we're right on time with our conversation. So this is the first passage, and I'll set the scene and then talk about it a little bit. John, the visionary who receives and writes Revelation, has gone up into heaven, and he's gone in to the throne room where God sits on a throne. And in the heavenly throne room, like in the Psalms, there are all these other heavenly beings who are there to praise God and do God's will. But he sees the one seated on the throne, God, holding a scroll. And the scroll has 7 seals around it. If you were reading Revelation for the first time, that wouldn't mean anything to you. As you continue to read Revelation, as those seals are opened up, the fate of history starts to unroll. In other words, this scroll, this book that God is holding on the throne, contains the fate of the world. But the problem is, no one in heaven has the ability to open the scroll or break its seals. So without reading the whole passage, that's the moment. John has been crying because no one can open the scroll. And he hears one of these heavenly beings, an elder, saying, "Do not weep," is nice translation talk. Stop crying. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered. He can open the scroll and its 7 seals. If you've been in church around Advent, and by the way, please interrupt me anytime you want to. I'll worry about time. I'm a classroom teacher. I don't mind. That's what we do. But if you've been in church during Advent a lot, you know that this Lion of Judah language is messianic language. So we're imagining that we're going to encounter Jesus here as a lion. And if you can imagine an author who thinks the world is messed up and wants things to be brought to right, and we'll talk about that. But if you can just imagine an author who wants God to take charge in the world, a lion is a really great image to use. So the next slide is not from Revelation. That verse about the lion is a trap. Because you're never going to get a lion. Throughout the whole book of Revelation, no lion shows up. You go from verse 5 that I just read to verse 6, Then I saw between the throne and the four living creatures and among the elders, not a lion, a lamb, standing as if it had been slaughtered. So rather than a lion stomping and roaring and tearing things up and devouring, right, this lamb has been killed, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. And it is the lamb that will be Revelation's symbol for Jesus rather than a lion. So what am I suggesting is up with that? I think Revelation, well, for one thing, it's an example of ancient Jewish apocalyptic literature, but in that literature, you get a lot of symbolism, a lot of sort of condensed, I like to call it poetic language. You get monsters and dragons and a woman clothed with the sun and a lamb and a prostitute and a bride and a city. You get all these things in Revelation. And those symbols are ways that Revelation does theology. Whenever I teach Revelation, 90% of the time, I start with this passage because it's a great example of what can happen when you put 2 symbols against each other, right? A lion or a lamb, and ask the question, if you're feeling powerless, if you're frustrated with how the world is, do you want a Messiah who acts like a lion or a Messiah who acts like a lamb? And I mean, to come back to that slide, Revelation tricks you. So when I read this passage aloud in class, when we get to the lamb, I get to the point where I say, well, then I saw between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders, a lion stomping and roaring and chewing things up, which is not what Revelation says. And it'll take the students like 30 seconds to stop me and saying, what Bible are you reading from? What are you doing? But that is the way Revelation kind of works. It uses these symbols to interpret its own time and place and to sort of shape, like, how do we want God to be active in the world? How does God work in the world? Now, it's interesting, the Apostle Paul makes the same argument in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about the cross being silliness. And he says, but God's weakness is stronger than human strength. And he goes on and makes the argument that the way God saves the world is through the weakness of the cross. But Paul isn't a poet. John is, the author of Revelation is, and rather than, writing an essay about it, he gives you a word picture. Now, I'll pause for a second before I go on. The problem with that is we usually need help with it, right? I mean, not many people would have read that passage and just said, oh, that's what's going on, because it takes time to get used to it. But we'll do some more of that tonight with Revelation, just sort of feeling how it kind of works. And this is, for me, the best example I can think of. Anything right now, like, for example, that wasn't clear at all to me, or, but wait, what about? Anything like that anyone has on their minds at this moment?
I was, like many years ago, I was part of a church where they were reading the book of Revelation very much, and this was like the Great Tribulation, the rapture, and then the correlation with the book of Daniel.
Yes.
And, and so ever since I've kind of moved away from reading it a bit, because it seems this apocalyptic literary genre is so foreign to me. I just don't even know what kind of literature this is. It doesn't
I really hear that.
foreign to me. I mean, I guess to all of us.
I really hear that. It's not comfortable for us as modern people. Most of us probably don't think we live in a world filled with angels and devils who are running around interfering in stuff moment by moment. We might not, I don't know. I haven't met you all before. But if you survey Presbyterians, a lot of them believe in heaven, but a lot of them don't believe in hell. Right? Those kinds of things. Terry, what I would say about it is, I think as Christians, if we dodge the apocalyptic stuff, we're dodging most of the New Testament, or at least avoiding parts of it that are essential to how it works. Like, as far as, in the Gospels, Jesus talks about this same stuff. And so as modern Christians who may not see the world through an ancient Mediterranean lens, and if that's where you are, that's where I am, the question has been, then what do we do? And for me, I don't know if you're familiar with the children's book, Going on a Bear Hunt. So we're going on a bear, I can't recite the book, but this group is going on a bear hunt, not really, but they're pretend, and they get to a pond, and can't go over it, can't go under it, can't go around it, got to go through it. And they get the next obstacle. It's the same. I think we have to work through this kind of language because it was formative to Jesus. It was formative to Paul. It's all over the New Testament. We can cut it out and try to, but even the idea of a Messiah came out of apocalyptic literature. So,
what do you mean by this?
Well,
like what you mean from the book of Daniel or from?
Well, I'll share a screen for a second to sort of get at it. We have a chunk of ancient Jewish and Christian apocalypses written around the time Revelation was. Daniel is one of the first. There's a book called First Enoch that we never hear about in Protestant churches that's part of the Bible in the Ethiopic church. And is sometimes quoted within the New Testament, like some New Testament authors knew the book of Enoch. Here's a list of them. And they help us understand Revelation because they work like Revelation. If I had more time, and I didn't put that in this presentation, but I would share quotes from all of these books, and you would say, oh, that sounds like Revelation, right? Parts of Daniel do, as you pointed out, Terry. It's in that literature that Jews begin talking about a Messiah, even they'll use the word Son of Man that's in Revelation, who's going to come and kick butt and fix things. So if people are calling Jesus Messiah, during the first century, the first thing they think about is this person who comes and fixes the world forever, a new king. And they should. That's the only way people talked about it. The other idea that, most Jews in the ancient world, up until a couple of centuries before Jesus, thought that when you died, you kind of just died.
Yep.
And you hear that language in the Psalms. There's no memory of God there. Your food is dirt. It's dusky. You're kind of not dead, but you're not alive. And the first time we encounter the idea of a resurrection is in the book of Daniel, which is an apocalyptic book. So that's what I mean. I mean, ideas that are kind of core to Jesus and Paul in the New Testament, we first see take really clear shape in these apocalypses. The other thing I'd like to say before we head on, because I'd like to get a little more specific about Revelation, is once we start reading this literature that way, we realize that the writers of these apocalypses are very much engaged with their own time and place. They're not thinking about 20 centuries off into the future. And the books are usually, not always, but they're usually politically oriented. So if you think about ancient Judah, there were the Babylonians, and then there were the Persians, and then there were the Greeks, and then there were the Romans. And sometime during that Greek period, some ancient Judeans started writing apocalypses. And Daniel is political. The empires are described as a beast, right? A series of beasts. And the Son of Man comes and drives off the beast and establishes an eternal kingdom. Revelation uses the same framework. There's a lamb and there's the beast, and they have a conflict. And the lamb wins. And then there's peace and prosperity and beauty in the world after that. So that's what I mean when I say, I think we have to work through it, which isn't the same as we have to make our minds believe things we can't make them believe.
Greg, was this apocalyptic genre, was this also, is it specifically Jewish, or is this also found outside of Jewish literature?
It certainly has influences from other parts of the ancient Near East. There's some Greek and Roman literature that kind of brushes onto it. Persian literature certainly influenced the emergence of apocalyptic literature. But it's also a little different. The whole Messiah thing, the idea of a new David coming, that's a Jewish idea. Yeah, great questions. I don't know if anyone else would like to before I think about moving on just a little bit. Well, what I haven't done, and it's 7:30, so maybe I should, is talk about what Revelation is trying to do. And sort of a general picture. The first thing, Revelation is extremely clear on this point, that it was written to 7 churches, little Christian assemblies, in cities in what was then called Asia. It would be a Roman province that corresponds to Western Turkey to us. Has anyone in this group ever been to that part of Turkey, like Ephesus or Pergamum? Yeah. So you can nod or say out loud, or like, how about Ephesus? Were you all at Ephesus? Jaw-droppingly amazing Roman ruins in Ephesus.
Yeah.
It's one of the 7 cities. Probably the 4th largest city in the Roman Empire. You could go on about Ephesus, but it's a significant place in the ancient world. So John and Revelation, in Revelation, Jesus speaks to each of these 7 churches individually. Some are doing well, some are doing poorly, some are doing mixed. He tells them essentially, keep doing it, or you better change, or else, or mixed. Revelation's worried about how the believers in those 7 cities are going to follow Jesus. And they basically have a couple of challenges that John is worried about. One challenge is, how do you follow Jesus in a world that is thoroughly religious? And we don't often think of the Roman world as thoroughly religious, but way more religious than we are. But I used to be in Rotary Club. I loved Rotary Club. I think it's great. We always said the Pledge of Allegiance, and we had prayer before we ate, right? I'm sure people who were in our Rotary Club who weren't Christians sometimes were uncomfortable with the prayers that were said. Does that make sense? Right? If we had, a chaplain praying in public schools, and they only had, I don't know, Southern Baptists doing the praying. It's my background. People would be upset. So imagine, the example I like to give is, imagine you're a stonemason in Ephesus, and you're a member of this, they would have had a trade union. And if you're a stonemason, being in that trade union is how you get work. Every meeting of the Stonemason Society is going to start with a religious observance to the patron god of the stonemasons. Maybe an acknowledgement and a prayer on behalf of the emperor. The city of Ephesus had temples and festivals dedicated to Roman emperors, not to mention a bunch of other big temples. All the parts of your life, every public meal, every public observance has this stuff. And John is saying to these believers, you can't do that and follow Jesus. Think what that means for them. They can lose their livelihoods. They can lose their families. And John mentions some people who have been killed. We don't know the backstory. The Romans wouldn't have done it, but maybe, there was some sort of resistance to them refusing to participate in these things. And he mentions that. He's asking these believers to totally abstain from all the trappings of Roman imperial religious culture. And, I'm not, there's no avoiding doing it, but you remember what's happened when athletes haven't stood for the national anthem. We're talking about that kind of, you're considered a bad citizen, disloyal if you don't participate. So I'd like to look at a couple of passages where Revelation begins to address these kinds of things. And so we will, if you'll just bear with me with the screen sharing bit and sliding around from slide to slide. So in chapter 13, we met the Lamb just now, but in chapter 13, Revelation introduces this thing called the beast. And the beast and the Lamb will go to war against one another. I'll read just the first few verses of chapter 13. I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 diadems on its horns and a blasphemous name on its head. The beast I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's. Its mouth was like a lion's mouth. All of those animals show up as beast in Daniel 7. So Revelation is sampling Daniel there. And the dragon, you would have learned earlier, is Satan, gave the beast his power and throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth followed the beast with amazement. People worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who can fight against it?" A little later, verse 7, it reads, "And the beast was allowed to make war against the saints and to conquer them." What I wanted to call attention to with this little slide that I have in front of you is how Revelation is creating a conflict between the Lamb and the beast, right? The Lamb has horns and eyes. The beast has horns and heads. The Lamb receives worship. The beast receives worship. The Lamb's followers receive marks on their foreheads. The beast followers, if you keep reading, are marked on their hand and their head. The beast has a sponsor, the dragon. The Lamb has a sponsor. The Lamb stands in front of the throne where God sits. There are other points of comparison we could make. But what Revelation is doing by introducing the beast is saying, and maybe I'll stop the slide so I can see your faces better. Those of you who have been to Ephesus, if you were walking down the streets in ancient Ephesus, it was pretty grand, yeah? And right and left are these temples dedicated to the Roman gods. Very narrow streets, very tall buildings, not as tall as New York, but a lot more narrow streets, right? You're surrounded by that. And Revelation has it, who is like the beast? Who could make war against it? What Revelation is suggesting is if you follow the Lamb, you can't participate in all the beast things. And the beast, literally, according to Revelation, makes war on the saints. So it's dangerous to follow Jesus, according to this. That's one of the big complaints Revelation has with Rome, but it has another set of complaints that I'd like to introduce. It uses, I'm sorry, yes, please.
And Greg, when you say following the beast, are you almost equating it to Roman culture? I know you've kind of talked about Roman religion, but
Right.
like walking down Ephesus, seeing
Right.
everything left and right. Do you mean Roman culture more?
Yeah. What I'd say, Joel, is you asked a modern question.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean is you asked a question where
Right.
there's culture and there's religion and they're separate.
Yeah, gotcha. That's a good
And
point.
in the ancient world, it's all the same. If you don't worship the imperial gods, they don't protect your city.
Yep. Thank you for clarifying that. Yep.
Yeah.
That's good.
But
Yeah.
isn't it also about
Great.
Caesar worship?
I mean, that's what the worship of the beast language is about, Harold. Thank you.
Yeah.
And the fascinating thing about it, I don't have time to get technical about it, but we know this from research, not the kind of research I do, but I follow the people who do. This worship of the emperor didn't come from Rome. The cities would send delegations to the Roman Senate and ask permission to have these festivals and temples. It was like asking permission to get the Super Bowl or a political convention or the Olympics. It was a sign of honor from Rome if you could do it. So it's local people who are driving this.
Probably good for the economy too.
Okay, see, this is the problem with me. Now you're like making, so I don't want to bore anybody, but this is fascinating to me. Probably 20 years or so after Revelation was written, in a Roman province called Bithynia, next to Asia in central Turkey, the local governor wrote a letter to the emperor saying, they're bringing me Christians. I don't want them. I don't want anything to do with them. I don't know what to do. And he says, so what I do is I tell them, you need to offer an offering to the gods. I've been told Christians won't do that. If they do that, fine, they can go home. I don't want anything to, but some of them won't do it. And he said, so then I tell them, look, your life is at stake. You have to do it. And he says, well, you know, most of them do. And then he says, but some don't. And if you can imagine this Roman administrator in nowhere Turkey writing back and saying, I figure if they're that stubborn, they deserve to die. Then he says, to the point about commerce and morale, then he says, and since I've started doing that, business has picked up and public spirit has gone up. So I'll put in chat, you can read the letter online. There's a website, if you just Google that, you can read, and you can read Trajan's response. In other words, Pliny, this Roman governor, has no idea that there's no policy about Christians. He doesn't know what to do. He's never thought about it before. But when they're brought to him and they're not willing to observe, he feels he has to enforce something.
Mhm.
And he connects it with business and public spirit.
Mm.
There's another part of Revelation's complaint about Rome that I do want to share. And I might even stop with the academic stuff after this, but it's not just that Rome has this imperial government and that there's worship of the various gods, including the emperor. John's worried about Roman commerce. And so he describes Rome as a prostitute. I wish I had time to go into it, but he describes Rome as a prostitute. She's dressed with all this fabulous stuff, but she's actually drunk on human blood. That's how he describes her in chapter 17. And she's destroyed and it's gruesome. And he writes, and the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. And let's just look at the cargo: gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, scarlet. These are all luxury items that are the kinds of things Rome would extract from other parts of the empire. All kinds of scented wood, all articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, choice flour, and wheat. I didn't think anything of that until I learned that most people ate really bad bread. And we know that because their teeth would break on the stones that would be in the bread that people dig up their bodies. Cattle and sheep, horses, which they weren't used for agriculture, they were used for the military, and chariots. And the final item on the list is slaves, human lives. Slaves made up about 20 to 40% of a Roman city's population. And they were extracted from all the places that Rome had conquered. So there were other ways people were enslaved, but the point being, Revelation has a complaint about Rome's economic exploitation too. So it's an absolute thorough rejection of Roman culture. The worship of the emperor, the worship of the imperial gods, the militarism, and the commerce. So what Revelation asks Christians to do, I guess I'll do just this one other slide, because what Revelation asks Christians to do is just be faithful to Jesus. And to me, this is the one verse in Revelation that gives, there are others, that gives this the most clearly. They have conquered the dragon, Satan. They've conquered the dragon by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life, even in the face of death. They don't fight. What would be the point? There's no, that would be silly. They continue to speak their faith in Jesus and abstain from these things, even in the face of death. That's what Revelation's asking them to do. I had, I'm not name dropping, except I am. Through no gift of mine, I got to eat dinner with Desmond Tutu. He came to Lancaster Seminary, and I just wound up sitting across from him. And I asked him, do they talk about Revelation? Did they do that during apartheid? And he said, not really. Well, rats. And then he said, except at the funerals. And I don't know if you remember the news coverage, but funerals in South Africa, when anti-apartheid activists were killed, would become protests often. And he said, at the funerals, we thought about Revelation, where in chapter 6, the martyrs cry out to God for vengeance. How long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth? And Joel, that gets to your question about violence. Revelation does describe a lot of violence. It never calls the audience to participate in it, but it does describe it as coming from God, right? The one thing, I live in Lancaster County, a lot of Mennonite theologians around, and they will point out that the Lamb makes war, but its only weapon is the sword that comes from its mouth. In other words, what if we think about the war being conducted just with the truth? But I'm not settled on that. Revelation is depicting a violent world. And the question is, where does the violence come from? I think of Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail, where he's being accused of inciting violence by protesting in Birmingham. And he says, the violence is already here in segregation. We're just bringing it to the surface. But we're not committing violence. We're just showing you what it looks like. I struggle with that question. I struggle with some other questions with Revelation, but it's 7:50 and I'll just stop, because all I really wanted to do with the amount of time we had was sort of talk about how Revelation works, the kind of language it uses, and what's the agenda of the book, what it's asking Christians to do in that context. So I'll just pause and we can talk about anything else, but I wanted to check in if you had comments or questions right now. Yes, Patty.
I'm thinking that in regard to what you just said, in regard to violence, etc., and I've not been a reader of Revelation. I've always been an intender to
Sure.
study Revelation. It sounds like it's depicting the truth about the world. I mean, the world is a very violent place, and humans are very violent creatures. We have a strong tendency to revert to that. So I would just say that, and in that regard, it sounds very realistic, which I don't think is what most of us think of in terms of Revelation. And I also, there was another thought floating through my head, and I'm afraid it slipped away for the moment. If it comes back, I'll let you know.
Never happens to me, but I want to tell you, a lot of people read Revelation just the way you do.
Yeah.
And the word apocalypse literally means to unveil, to reveal something that's hidden. And what Revelation is doing, many would argue, I would argue, is unveiling. You walk through Ephesus and you see these grand monuments to Roman glory. It's a monster. It's a drunk, bloodthirsty prostitute. I'm sorry, it's misogynistic in that way, and Revelation is misogynistic. I'm not gonna defend what you can't defend. But at the same time, it's trying to say, you think Rome is one thing, and you sing hymns to Rome, but it's deadly.
Would you say it's a book of metaphors?
It is. It is metaphor, symbol. Revelation interacts with the Hebrew scriptures very densely. And so you can tell a lot of literary crafting was put into writing it, even though to us that's hard to see. But when scholars sort of begin to open that up, like I tried to do by showing how Revelation describes the Lamb, and then 8 chapters later, a lot of the same frameworks describe the beast. So you would see the conflict.
So, Greg, I have a question.
Yeah,
how would you say Revelations is relevant today for a group of Christians? Here we are, the 9 of us that are not persecuted.
Absolutely. So I think what we need to do with Revelation is ask questions. One question Revelation confronts us with is, what are we loyal to? What are the realities in our cultural environment that compromise our faithfulness to Jesus in fundamental ways? And it's rare to meet someone who couldn't name some of those things. Like, I know I shouldn't participate in this, but this is how we get along. Revelation is the book in the New Testament that puts that in your face the most strongly. Your question, like, we're not persecuted, I agree. Are there ever times to be as radical, as exclusive, as absolute as John is? To put your foot down and say, this is the way of God, and there's not another way. In my whole life, that this is very few, right? And Christians who love Revelation, like the ones Terry are talking about, find reasons to put their foot down that way over all kinds of things. I think Terry remembers. I was in that world too. But yeah, Harold?
In every generation, somewhere in the world, people of goodwill have been persecuted.
Absolutely.
So I've always thought that the book of Revelation is a book specifically, well, maybe not specifically, but it's particularly, whatever, written for churches when they are being persecuted by oppressors. Think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church versus the German Christians and Nazi Germany. What's going on in China right now, or in the Middle East? Also the Catholic, Christians persecuted Christians over the centuries too. So the book is really a book of hope. Maybe it doesn't speak to us in the same way, because we have to say, well, are we being the oppressed or the oppressors? But the book of Revelation certainly speaks to those people in every generation who have experienced the lash. Or
that's absolutely right. Alan Bozak, if you remember him, and Black anti-apartheid activist, wrote a book about Revelation from prison. Absolutely. Though the one place that I would nudge a little on that is Revelation talks about Rome as an empire that exploits. I think we live in one. Our politics tend to be about how do we maintain the flow of goods into the United States from poorer places. I'm not negative about America. I grew up patriotic and am, but can we look at the ways things we do harm the environments, harm the economies, harm democracy in other places? And can we be critical? That question of faithfulness there. So I think the flip side is the United States isn't typically out there looking for people to persecute. I agree. But the way we do business is about what commerce we bring in here, which you could say about any Western country, right?
Yeah.
And
also,
sorry.
I'm sorry, you go ahead.
Well, one other issue folks have raised with Revelation is Revelation describes the end of this earth and the coming of a new one. And thinking about in a moment of environmental crisis, how do we imagine? So you could read the last 2 chapters of Revelation and decide what you think. The New Jerusalem, people don't go to heaven in Revelation. Jerusalem comes down to earth and has fresh water and new fruit. There's some ambiguity about how it deals with those things. So I will just share. Joel told me he might extend the conversation if people want to, but I know I'm running out of scheduled time. And it's not, this is if you're really that interested. But just this year, I published a book for church use on Revelation. It's called Faithful and True, which is a line from Revelation and also part of Auburn's fight song. So got that in under the editor. But it tries to help lay people work through parts of Revelation in sort of this way so that you get a bigger whole. But I think the point of doing this that Joel had was just, if we're going to be preaching about Revelation, having some folks in church who have a general idea of what the context is.
Yep.
Can I ask one more thing, Greg? Like if I think of Revelation also, I think a lot of people will think about a book of judgments, isn't it?
Yes.
So it's a series of judgment first against, the beast and so on. But then, of course, and I heard many messages about that, the great white throne judgment.
Yes.
And, which is really this final judgment, the lake of fire, the separation of the wicked and the godly, kind of a bit reminiscent of some of the teaching of Jesus in the Gospels about the goat and the sheep. And so how do you think the book of Revelation supports a theology of judgment? And I get it's it's not really a very popular subject in a way, but it seems it's very present. And what do we do with this?
So yes, there's judgment in Revelation, and it describes everybody who's not in the churches. It calls them the inhabitants of the earth, and they suffer judgment in all kinds of ways. I think on the whole, Revelation's incredibly negative toward them, everybody. Again, I would invite you to read those last 2 chapters. There are hints in there, like nothing unclean can come into the city. But then it says all the nations are coming in and bringing their gifts, which is language from Isaiah. It's hard to tell if Revelation is absolutely exclusive or not. I think the weight of it is exclusive, but it's hard to tell if it absolutely is or not. That's an interesting question. The other thing I've started thinking about, I'd say over the last 5 years, is we Protestants, I am going to take a minute to unpack this, but not long. We Protestants really think of judgment individualistically. Like, oh no, I'm not perfect. God is going to zap me. But that is not what judgment meant in ancient Judaism. So if you think about when Jesus says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, which is what the Greek says. The word we translate righteousness to most ancient people just meant justice. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice. He meant most people in most of history live without justice. In most of the world, judges are assumed to be corrupt. They're not your friend if you're an ordinary person. And what the idea of God as judge is, in a fundamental way, is God is going to make things right. That's the basic idea of judgment. Now, if you're like in Revelation, believing the world is totally corrupt and totally against you, that means most of the people in the world are going to suffer that judgment. I can't explain that away or make it okay. But when we individualize judgment, we're forgetting who the judge is. Right? If we think of the judge, and in Revelation, the judge is Jesus, then we're supposed to trust him. And trust for a good healing. I mean, so I'm not saying Revelation doesn't have problems on violence and judgment. Please don't hear me trying to just paper over that. What I'm saying is we do have work to do in terms of our aversion to the judgment language, in terms of what it meant to ancient Jews and Christians, which is finally someone who wants to do what's right is going to be running things in the world.
One of the things I've been struggling with Revelations is the lack of God's mercy.
Mm.
It seems to have disappeared.
It's not really big on that.
I don't like that.
No, I have a passion for explaining why Revelation is relevant to us, because it offers, so I said questions that don't get pressed us in the same way in other parts of the New Testament. So to me, it's an essential book, and you see me arguing for that. But Cornelia, I've published an article on the violence problem. It has a clear misogyny problem. The vengeance thing, it has a desire for vengeance. I absolutely agree. And I think that's part of why it's important for us as Christians, when we're sorting through the New Testament, to hear the whole thing, right? There's not a book in the New Testament that you can't raise complaints about. But they do speak to each other, right? And so what I would argue is Revelation has things to say that we need to engage, but that's very different than recommending it as the guideline for all the things we need to think about. And I think Harold is right. The context in which we're reading it is important. But even then, I would say, there are some things about Revelation. I'm with you. I don't know if that was a helpful reply. I'm a classroom teacher. When your eyes go down, I know. Yeah.
Well, she's a teacher too, so she
knows the look. She knows the look.
Yeah.
I get the look a lot.
I know, it's a really good question, and it doesn't have there's not a comfortable answer sometimes to that question.
And sometimes that's good. And I know that once I really read all of Revelation, I'm still not going to really get it or like it entirely. And that's just the way it is. But I don't know, a lot of faith is about not always having clear and simple answers. Most of life is lived in the gray areas, not in the black or the white. And of course, Revelation is suggesting there is the black and the white, the good and the bad, the insiders and the outsiders, and all of that, which was a very, very Hebrew approach to the world. I think, the Hebrew nation saw itself as the insiders, etc. But we like to think that there is such clarity about things, and we'd like to think that we're on the side with the right answers. And I go, what right? Which right answers? Really? I don't know. I just, as Christians, at least today, perhaps forever, it just seems like we need to wrestle with the gray and acknowledge that a lot of this is in the gray areas, I think. And I think you're kind of saying that because you take Revelation and you look for the things that can teach us, and try to understand where it's coming from and why and all of that, and then also acknowledge, there's this other stuff too that's just not really what we want to think about.
I think, Joan, if you hang around Jews, they use scripture differently than we do, right? We have a tradition of, okay, we're reading a Bible passage. What does that tell me to do and believe? And Jews talk back to the Bible and to each other, right? They read it alone, but they also read it in community. And they acknowledge that, this passage, but that passage, this passage, but that circumstance, right? And I think if we can engage the Bible that way, again, what it does is different parts of the Bible put different things in front of us. And we do step back. I don't ask my students to just shatter their faith into a bunch of fragments. We do step back and try to pull it all together, but recognizing, I think what you were suggesting, Patty, that even in that act, there's going to be some like rough fits, right?
Yeah. I think we have, as Christians, I think that a lot of folks struggle in the same way with the Hebrew Bible. I mean, as opposed to the New Testament.
Yeah.
You know, it's either disarming or scary or violent or God is vengeful, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, unless you really dig into the Hebrew Bible and learn something about it. And it's wonderful.
And our New Testament has some stuff.
It has some stuff, which worries a lot of people, especially non-Christians.
Yeah. And to be free enough to say that, right? Because you can't do that in all churches. Terry and I have the experience of being in churches. You know, if you ask those questions, it's time to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm trying to find the right words for this. It seems to me that the book of Revelation, when it talks about God being angry or going to the jugular vein, we're talking about not just the concept of evil. So there is a black and white, because there is good in the world and there is evil in the world, and there are evil systems in the world. And there are people who are involved in this in varying degrees. But you know, when I read Revelation, I think in terms of Jesus standing up against the power of evil. You know, I was watching the other day or yesterday a thing on the rise of the Nazis, and they had a whole thing about Heinrich Himmler and the terrible, awful things he did. To me, the book of Revelation is tailor-made for that situation. And, you know, the whole thing about judgment, you know, I like what you said. From what I understand, the Jewish understanding of judgment is going to a civil court where you are the plaintiff, and you're going to, you're gnawing at the judge to do the right thing. So it's the, you know, but with Christians, it's like you're going to a criminal court, and you're either guilty or innocent. Yeah.
Right.
But with the with Revelation, it's, you know, I don't want to make it sound simplistic, but it is about what do we do with the evil in the world? What does God expect of us or hope for us? So
and when do we need to name it? Right.
Yeah.
You know, a few years ago, I was serving a church part-time as resident scholar, and some of my politics are going to come across, but this to me is not a Republican Democrat thing. It was at the time. But when we did a travel ban against Muslims coming into the United States, that meant that people literally couldn't come back and be with their families if they had.
Yep.
You know, I said in my little session in church, you know, sometimes we need to be able to say something is just wrong and get past who we voted for and what the politics are. To me, that was not the grandest example in history, but a clear one. You know, immigration's complicated. I'm fine, but don't split up families while people are still on the airplane. I mean, just, you know, it just seemed clear to me. There haven't been that many times I've said, and someone came up to me later and said, you know, when you did that, you didn't give the other side. You didn't let someone speak for the other side. And you always do. And I said, we're in church. There's not another side.
Right.
And that's rare. That is not my, even though I have very strong opinions, and I do.
Yeah.
But to think that there's not, you know, it's very rare for me not to understand why someone would see it differently than I do.
Do we have any other questions? We've gone a little over, but I wanted to give us a little more time.
No questions, but just a comment. I've spent a lot of time in Rome. I did part of my graduate work there, so been to the Vatican, been to the Sistine Chapel, and of course you see the Last Judgment on the wall. Very, very terrifying, right? And then in Florence, you'll see the same thing in the ceiling of the baptistry, in the Byzantine style, but again, very terrifying. And you'll see that in work probably all throughout Italy and Europe in general. And it just it's a way of getting the message across, right? Where we're talking about the book of Revelation tonight, and this is just another way of communicating those messages through art.
I think that's right, Scott. One of the things I didn't share is the people the apocalyptic writers are the most angry at.
Mm-hmm.
If they're Jewish authors, they're the most angry at Jews who aren't doing what they're supposed to do.
Mm.
Revelation is actually most angry at the Christians who aren't following John's way. And it acknowledges, you get that in the first 3 chapters. Apocalyptic literature is really, even though it does critique empires very often, it almost always has this edge of, you're the ones who are going to be faithful. There won't be many. And that's where you get, like Harold referenced, someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who saw the world that way. There aren't going to be many of us.
I was also thinking during our discussion tonight, a lot of the things that Revelation is asking about is, we're talking about massive societal change where, the letters that go out to the 7 churches, and they're asking a big thing of the people of the empire, people living in those 7 cities, to give up everything they've known to follow Jesus. And it's probably had been terrifying and scary for them to get those letters.
I think so. And to note that people who become Christian in some parts of the world experience that today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yep. Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Greg, this has been fantastic. Really appreciate you giving us this.
Yeah, thank you.
tonight.
It's an honor for me, and it's been fun. So thank you all.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to everybody else for joining us tonight. We'll hopefully do it again. I'd love to.
Thank you for
Cool.
making this possible, Joel.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Joel. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you,
care,
Greg.
everyone.
Take care.
Have a good night,
Good night,
everybody.
You too.
Take care.